They objected to him, humiliated him, bullied him, and they did not know who they were messing with. The long, quiet bus ride to Lincoln Heights in Missouri leaves him alone to watch, while the scenery outside the window gradually changed from crowded streets to suburban neighborhoods where every house looked like it had been copied from its neighbors. It was not his first time being the new kid, but this change felt all different. His mom had secured a better job, and as per his uncle's advice, he had to take this move as a new beginning, but there were no new beginnings in this town for a person like him. He actually felt the moment when he set foot on Richmond High's campus. The conversation stopped when he went by, and some students looked at him only to turn their eyes away, pretending they did not see him staring. A kind of politeness that bordered on excessive. The teachers smiled too wide, and their voices sounded too forced. Dorian gave no response. He had been there before. The first 3 periods went without any problems. He took his assigned seat, responded to calls, and tried to keep his mind on academics. But by the time lunch rolled in, the feeling that hundreds of eyes were fixed on him had started to rub an itch beneath his skin. After grabbing a lunch tray, he surveyed the cafeteria for a place to sit. Most tables were already filled with groups of students trapped in conversations that presumably did not include him. A few students shot glances at him. Some murmured. Finally, he spotted an open seat beside a guy who was too busy on his phone to care. Not perfect, but yeah, that would do. Dorian had hardly set his tray down when a voice rang out over the noise. "You lost?" Dorian turned. Henceforth, a blonde guy with an easy smirk and far too much confidence leaned in his chair, while a few at his table glanced on and laughed aloud. Dorian exhaled slowly. "Didn't know I needed a map." The guy chuckled, shaking his head. "Just checking, ain't too many. New faces around here." Dorian seized the doubt in the voice, the unsaid part of the sentence. He didn't lose the guy's gaze, his expression inscrutable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but there was something behind it. Mirth, interest, maybe something else. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man." Dorian was quiet. He just sat down and picked up his fork. The message was clear. This was just the commencement. But it had begun with petty glances and whispers and was gradually escalating to something worse. For a while, it was nothing major, just a couple of side comments in the halls, often just loud enough for him to hear. Didn't know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last. Nothing new to him. He ignored it. He wasn't here to entertain their ignorance. But Bryce just wasn't the kid to let nothing slide. Bryce Tanner had the confidence of a kid who never even glanced behind him. I mean, come on! His dad has a monopoly on half the car dealerships in town, and their crew followed him like he was royalty, a star quarterback, a student body golden boy who usually got away with just about everything. And for whatever reason, Bryce decided Dorian being at Ridgemont was a problem. The first real test came at Dorian's locker. He had been changing out books when a sharp push knocked him off center, smashing his shoulder into the metal, the sound rippling through the corridor. "Oops, Bryce, acting all innocent. Didn't see you there." Dorian did not bat an eyelid. He had finished grabbing his notepad and shut the locker door, moving slowly and deliberately. If he gave them nothing, the nemesis would soon be bored. Bryce chuckled. "Pretty quiet, huh? That's cool, real cool." Dorian turned and looked at him, not angry or scared, just looking. For an instant, the smirk on Bryce's face flickered. Then one of his friends, Nick or maybe Kyle, they all blended together, whispered something, and Bryce smiled once more. "Catch you later, new guy." Dorian's eyes followed them as they walked away. The noise in the hallway resumed. That was the first time. The second time was in the cafeteria. As Dorian was heading for the trash bins, a foot came out, very much there and not meant to pull back. Dorian lurched forward but managed to brace himself in time. Laughter. Bryce raised his hands. "Chill, dude." That was a joke. Dorian didn't respond. He couldn't be bothered to look at him. He simply stepped over Bryce's foot and carried on. More laughter. Someone muttered, "Too easy." Dorian clenched his teeth. The voice of his uncle resonated through his mind. A lion does not blink when hyenas bark. A deep breath. Forget about it. But it wasn't enough. The third time, this time Bryce, ensured it wasn't merely a joke which triggered the real change. It was the end of the school day, and Dorian had just completed his work in the library. The other students had now left, with only a handful milling about on the campus. There was no hurry, for his mother wouldn't be home from work for at least a couple of hours, and he was okay with that. Just outside, familiar voices washed over him like a wave. "Hey, new guy!" Dorian barely had time to look over as something slammed against his back with enough force to make him stagger forward, grasping for balance with his hands just before he hit the ground. Laughter. He turned slowly. Bryce stood there with Nick, Kyle, and several other guys whose names didn't really matter, but he was sure they were significant in some little odd way. Bryce still held his drink cup with the last few drops tumbling down his fingers. "Oops, my bad," Bryce said, trying not to sound sorry. "Didn't see you there." Dorian glanced down. His hoodie was covered in soda with ice cubes scattered at his feet. Silence stretched between them. The students remaining in the parking area had stopped to gawk. Dorian inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Bryce smiled. "Come on, man. Say something." Dorian didn't speak but started to walk past. That was when Bryce gave him a shove. It was forceful, intended to be an actual threat. Dorian stumbled back a step, exhaled calmly, his fingers flexing at his sides. Bryce laughed. "What? Are you scared?" Nick stepped up, grinning. "Nah, man, he's just soft." All of Dorian's life, he had heard "walk away." He could hear his uncle's voice in his head, "Rich and comfortable don't provoke them. It's not right to give them what they want." But at the moment, Bryce had no desire for an easy laugh. He wasn't just joking. He was after a reaction. He wanted to prove something. After a final deep breath, Dorian let his backpack down on the floor. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you want to talk now?" Dorian did not answer. He just rolled his shoulders back. Bryce chuckled. "Man, you..." That was as far as he got. Dorian moved in a step in, quick, clean, a left feint, just enough to make Bryce react, then a sharp right hook to his ribs. The sound was sickening. Bryce gasped and his body buckled, but Dorian still wasn't done. Pivot. Uppercut. Perfect form. Bryce's head snapped back, and before he could decide whether to stay on his feet, his legs just didn't want to listen anymore. He hit the pavement hard. Silence. Nick and the others gaped at Dorian, speechless. Dorian stepped back, adjusted his hoodie, and breathed calmly. Bryce groaned, rolled onto his side. Finally, Dorian spoke. "Anyone else?" Bryce did not answer, just coughed. Dorian turned to the others. "Anyone else?" Nobody said anything. Dorian slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked away without a second word. But whatever happened in that parking lot had not really been finished. It was just the start of it. By the next day, the entire school knew. Dorian didn't have to check his phone to know the looks he got told him all he needed to know. The stares were no longer curious. Some looked impressed, some looked nervous, and a few looked as though they were seeing him for the first time. Bryce had not come to school. That part didn't surprise him. Getting that filthy in front of half the parking lot wasn't something one recovered from overnight. No. Nick and Kyle had kept their distance. Dorian walked into class like nothing had happened. He sat down, pulled out his notebook. Business, as usual, but it didn't mean chatter was over. During lunch, Nick walked by in the cafeteria and conversations halted when he passed through. Whispered noises. A couple nodded like they respected him all of a sudden. Freshman kids who hadn't spoken to him before acted like he was a kind of legend. And then there were other comments. "Damn, I didn't know new kid could throw a punch," one said in passing. "Bryce had it coming," another one's voice added. "Heard he won't be back for a week." Dorian simply ignored them. He wasn't there to be a hero. He wasn't desperate for validation. Then, as he sat down, he heard something else. "He is just another thug." The words were softly said, but not softly enough. Dorian slightly turned his head. There were a couple of girls at a nearby table, one a brunette decked in expensive-looking jewelry, with what looked like a smell she didn't like. His stomach clenched. That's the thing with moments like these. No matter how justified you were, or how right the situation felt, there was always someone who could twist things around. But he didn't regret it. Bryce went looking for a fight, and Dorian just made sure he got it. Now this was beginning to weigh him down. Dorian had spent years training, years controlling himself, years in self-restraint. That was not weakness. That was strength. So why was he feeling so weak? So why did it seem that no matter which choice he made, the world had already decided who he would be? But Dorian was convenient to learn that true strength wasn't just about throwing a punch. It was about what came next. By the next morning, the whole school knew. Dorian didn't have to check his phone to know that. The way people looked at him told the whole story. The stares were no longer a matter of just mere curiosity. They were different. Some of them were impressed, others were nervous. Some looked at him as though they were seeing him for the first time. Bryce wasn't in school. That part wasn't surprising. You don't just bounce back from a hit like that in front of half the parking lot overnight. Nick and Kyle? They stayed away. Dorian walked into class as if nothing had happened, sat down, pulled out his notebook. Business as usual. But the gossip still hadn't died down. At lunch, as he made his way through the cafeteria, conversations fell silent as he passed by. People whispered. A few nodded as if they suddenly actually respected him. Some of the freshmen who hadn't even spoken to him before treated him like some sort of legend. And then there were the others. Damn, didn't know new guy had hands, someone mumbled while passing by. Bryce invited this, another voice added. Word has it he's not coming back for a week. Dorian ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero, nor did he seek validation. All this time he was embattled. He's just another violent thug. The words were soft, but not soft enough. Dorian slightly turned his head. A couple of girls at a nearby table, one of them a brunette donned in expensive-looking jewelry, and her expression was likely smelling something bad, glanced away once she saw he'd caught her. His stomach clenched. That was the thing about moments. Like this. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. Not that he regretted it. Bryce had gone looking for a fight. Dorian made sure he got it. Still, that fact sat heavily upon him. He had spent years training, years controlling himself, years walking away. That was not weakness, that was strength. Then why did it feel like whatever choice he made, people had already made up their minds about who he was? Dorian was about to learn that real strength was not in delivering a punch, but in what one did next. The rest of the week faded in a blurrish hue. Bryce still had not shown. His friends ceased worrying Dorian. The stares lessened a little. The whispers, however, quieted down. Yet there was still something hanging in the air. Dorian could feel it. One afternoon, leaving the gym, Coach Harrison called him over. Got a minute? Dorian waited, not wanting to be lectured, but something came to him in Coach's tone and made him stop. They walked out to where the football team was finishing practice. I heard what happened, Coach said. Figured you had your reasons. Dorian nodded. He wasn't going to apologize. Coach sized him up. You a fighter? Dorian shrugged. Been boxing since I was a kid. Coach whistled low. Yeah, that much is apparent. You're good. But let me ask you something. Did that fight change anything? Dorian looked at him, not sure where this whole deal was going with him. Coach crossed his arms. You think Bryce learned something? Think the rest of them did? Dorian exhaled hard and pulled his hand through his hair. He knew the answer. Bryce was not the type to ruminate. As far as the others went, some respected him now, some feared him, some would see him however they wanted, no matter what he did. Coach nodded, as if he could see the thoughts running through Dorian's head. Thing is, kids like Bryce, they don't lose in a lasting sense. He'll come back, he'll mouth off, and the cycle starts all over again. But you? He studied him. You're different. You have control. Dorian frowned. What are you saying? Coach tilted his head toward the field behind him. I've told the wrestling coach to send me a couple of kids. Ever thought about putting all that talent to better use? Dorian blinked. Wrestling? Coach smiled widely. Look, I know you can handle yourself, that much is obvious, but there's a big difference between winning a fight and actually learning how to harness your power. I've seen too many kids like you getting boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You already proved you're not to be messed with. Now prove there's much more to you than that. Dorian didn't answer right away. For him, for so long, survival was about survival, standing his ground. But the way Coach looked at him, the way he talked, wasn't this about proving something? It was more about being. He sat on his bed that night, staring at his uncle's old boxing gloves. He thought of all the times he'd held back, all the times he'd walked away, and one time he hadn't. Coach was right. Bryce wouldn't change. People would think what they wanted. But Dorian still had a choice. And this time, maybe he'd have a different one. Because true strength wasn't about knowing when to fight. It was about knowing what to fight for. If this left a mark on you, kindly click on that subscribe button. Life is full of choices, and sometimes the hardest decision is who you want to be. Discuss this in the comments. Have you ever been in a position where you had to stand your ground? How did you handle it? Let's keep the conversation going.